like to start with a question. How did LSD become LSD? So throughout World War II, and is appearing as late as 1958, those three letters, LSD, appeared sporadically in American newspapers. The acronym referred only, though, to the naval term, landing ships dock. However, a few years later, newspapers were full of headlines reading, LSD kills 20. LSD was suddenly a national threat and a generational craze. What happened in the course of those few years that put LSD so prominently on the cultural map? Why did LSD go viral? Over the course of this fellowship year, psychedelic culture has served as my test case for theories of virality. Interest in psychedelics seems to have spread rapidly across the American landscape in the 1960s. The virality model helps to capture the speed of that spread, the massive distribution, and the transnational scope of psychedelic culture during the era. But like Nicole, I'm mixed about the effectiveness of this metaphor. What is added to understanding when we apply this key term, viral, over traditional terms like distribution or circulation? In their recent book, Going Viral, Karine Nahoon and Jeff Hamsley give a good working definition of virality, which I'll quote in full. Virality is a social information flow process where many people simultaneously forward a specific information item over a short period of time within their social networks, and where the message spreads beyond their own social networks to different, often distant networks, resulting in a sharp acceleration in the number of people who are exposed to the message. Nahoon and Helmsley help us understand the infrastructural conditions required to accelerate the rate and scope of diffuse viral spread. Yet many questions remain for me as I try to apply the virality model to psychedelic cultural history. What is the cutoff for virality? How many people? How short of time? How sharp of acceleration? The next major stage of this project is to mine the enormous yet only partially digitized corpus of mid-20th century media to map out those psychedelic references across time and space. It's a major undertaking. So my attention this year has been on the people in those social networks, the art, which serve as the viral vehicles, and the richly effective messages that passed along during this turbulent decade. Today I'm going to tell you a story about why some ideas spread and how a generation suddenly turned on to a new vision of reality. I'm focusing on a narrow slice of the United States psychedelic history that characterized the sort of 60s hippie generation as we know it. Psychedelic culture has appeared in many forms from the start of human civilization, transcending cultural and national boundaries. To give you a brief background, by psychedelics, I mean the class of natural and chemical substances that, when ingested, affect the brain's serotonin and dopamine levels, often producing perceptual changes in thought, mood, and vision, otherwise rarely experienced. So these altered states are changed from your ordinary consciousness. These altered states are sometimes similar to those of dreams, meditative and trance states, religious exaltation, flashbulb memories, and acute mental disorder. Psychedelics are, according to current research, non-addictive and have few physiological effects, much unlike popular drugs like opioids, amphetamines, heroin, and cocaine. There are many documented psychedelic substances, but the most well-known and the most relevant to today's story are LSD, mescaline, peyote, psilocybin, and DMT. The effects of psychedelics are highly dependent on an individual's mindset, preparation, and environment, or as Timothy Leary famously described it, the set and setting. Though psychedelic experiences are highly relative and varied, as the online trip database Erowid will show you, there are a few constants that we can use to effectively classify these drugs. Many experience heightened sensations of light, color, form, and movement. Others perceive non-material forms, vibrations of energy, and auras of shimmering light. Some observe complex networks of interconnection, pattern, and flow. Visual alterations depend highly on dosage. Low doses tend to produce a heightened state of ordinary perception, like a vase of flowers will seem richer in color. The leaves might kind of breathe or pulse. Higher doses can produce intense feelings of bodily transfiguration and fantastic landscapes, as shown in one woman's account. Suddenly, my body was shaken by a terrific force, as if by a machine used for mixing paint. Something told me the shaking indicated the beginnings of a new life. Immediately, I became a magnificent feminine Pegasus. I had huge wings of snow-white feathers laid in perfect symmetry, dainty shell-pink nostrils, and large liquid blue eyes. My opalescent hoofs were of iridescent mother of pearl. We often associate psychedelics with visual hallucinations, but emotions actually play a central role in most psychedelic experiences. Psychedelics can produce tremendous waves of joy, ecstasy, peace, and compassion, but also periods of intense paranoia and terror. Users often report they feel part of a universal or cosmic order, experiencing strong feelings of global awareness and empathy towards others. Today, I'd like us to look at how psychedelic aesthetics, the literature, film, and art of altered states, offered up a nation a beautiful, illuminating, sometimes terrifying escape, sacrament, and tool. And America ate it up in droves. You'll see a familiar cast of cult characters and some forgotten figures that I'd like to restore to the canon. So what happened in the 60s? How did the nation go from Dick Clark's American Bandstand to Beatles' Sgt. Pepper? What inspired the Summer of Love and what caused the acid panic of the 60s? We start in Switzerland in 1938. In the midst of the Second World War, chemist Albert Hofmann was working in the lab on a new synthetic compound derived from the fungus ergot, which grows on rye and other grains. Hofmann was the first to synthesize lysergic acid dithalamide, more commonly known as LSD-25. He did not realize its psychedelic effects initially. It took a little while. In popular lore, the discovery was by sheer accident. While working on the crystallizations and inadvertently getting some on his fingertips, to give you a sense of the potency, Hofmann began to feel a bit disoriented. He wrote to his supervisor later, "Last Friday, April 16th, 1943, I was forced to interrupt my work in the laboratory in the middle of the afternoon and proceed home, being affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes of intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away." Curious about this experience and the extreme potency of just trace amounts, Hofmann decided to self-experiment by swallowing 250 micrograms mixed with water. He left work early and rode home on his bicycle with a colleague. As example to the enduring cult legacy of psychedelic history, the anniversary of Hofmann's first trip is celebrated by psychedelic enthusiasts on April 19th, called Bicycle Day. Initially haunted by paranoia and demonic visions, Hofmann thought he was having a mental breakdown. Eventually, he came to enjoy the experience. Hofmann believed that there was, to my knowledge, no other known substance that evoked such profound psychic effects in such extremely low doses that caused such dramatic changes in human consciousness and our experience of the inner and outer world. Sandoz Labs invested in Hofmann's discovery and began to circulate samples of the pharmaceutical to researchers in hopes of finding out more about this powerful drug and its psychological effects. From Sandoz Labs in Switzerland, LSD traveled to the United States. In 1949, Dr. Max Rinkel, a neuropsychiatrist in Boston, was the first to import the drug from Sandoz into the US. Though California would later become the iconic landscape of the psychedelic 60s, our very dear Boston figures very prominently in this early story of LSD. By 1943, Sandoz formally partnered with the National Mental Health Institute and the FDA to distribute LSD to interested researchers for purposes of analytic psychotherapy. Psychiatrists like Werner Stoll, Humphrey Osmond, and John Smith began to explore its use for the treatment of alcoholism, addiction, trauma, neuroses, and anxiety, that familiar string of modern illnesses. Initially, researchers thought LSD mimicked psychosis and could offer psychiatrists a window into the world of the schizophrenic. Though the psychosis model for LSD was gradually disproved, the association with mental illness and psychotic breakdown continues to haunt psychedelics in the cultural imagination. These early researchers were finding promising therapeutic uses and building ever new knowledge about the biochemistry of the brain and the neurological workings of consciousness. Psychedelic research was being conducted quite quietly in the medical community without much attention until a famous English author read a scientific article on the use of mescaline by Humphrey Osmond in 1952. LSD had renewed researchers' interest in mescaline, which had been long used in Native American medicinal and spiritual practice because of its hallucinogenic properties. Aldous Huxley, most famous for his dystopian novel Brave New World, was vastly curious about altered states from his research in theology, psychology, neuroscience, and his lifelong meditation practice. Huxley wrote to Osmond, and after some correspondence, invited him to visit in Los Angeles. He proposed that Osmond might, quote, bring a little mescaline, for I am eager to make the experiment and would feel particularly happy to do so under the supervision of an experienced investigator like yourself. Osmond was currently seeking trial subjects, particularly in individuals with the power of description, much like Huxley. Huxley was, in his own words, on the spot and willing, indeed eager to be a guinea pig. Osmond, whose research was based in Saskatchewan, Canada, flew across the US border with a bottle of mescaline in his luggage. Mescaline was legal at the time. The resultant experiment inspired Huxley's first book on psychedelics, The Doors of Perception, published in 1954. In the next year, Huxley tried LSD with longtime colleague Gerald Hurd and Al Hubbard, another central figure in the history of psychedelic distribution. Captain Al Hubbard, nicknamed Captain Trips and described as the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, traveled around the US in the early 1960s, giving away thousands of samples of LSD to businessmen, scholars, politicians, and artists, even pairing up with AA founder Bill Wilson. Hubbard formerly worked for the Office of Secret Services and may have had ties with the CIA's secret MK Ultra research on behavioral engineering. The CIA gave its psychedelics and other pharmaceutical drugs to unsuspecting civilians in illegal studies of mind control. Huxley was very concerned about these very possibilities, even as he saw psychedelics as a real potential tool. After his LSD experiment, he wrote another short book on psychedelics called Heaven and Hell, with the headlines from the CIA. Heaven and Hell in 1956. The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell, are often published together and are arguably the most influential aesthetic and theoretical statements on psychedelics in the 20th century. The Osmond-Huxley collaboration yielded a rich dialogue between the arts and the sciences. They form one of the most important nodes of psychedelic virality. In fact, the term psychedelic itself was coined by this interdisciplinary pair. Huxley and Osmond were dissatisfied with the terms of their day. Osmond suggested psychedelics, from the Greek, meaning mind manifesting. In an exchange of letters, Osmond penned a couplet to remind Huxley of the spelling. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. Though the proper terminology is still debated, psychedelic caught on as the key word of the 60s generation and remains the dominant label for these substances. Huxley's account of his mescaline and LSD trips captivated audiences, enticing some readers with his suggestion that these drugs might offer a glimpse into the worlds of artists like William Blake, Vermeer, and Beethoven. Quoting Huxley, I might so change my ordinary mode of consciousness as to be able to know from the inside what the visionary, the medium, and even the mystic were talking about. His texts provide audiences a representational map of altered states. Huxley makes psychedelic emotions and visions recognizable to unfamiliar readers through fantastic symbols and realist detail. The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell became bestsellers in the 1950s and 60s and have remained continually in print ever since. Huxley's turn to psychedelic subjects was met with mixed reviews. The German novelist Thomas Mann regarded The Doors of Perception as, quote, unscrupulous aesthetic self-indulgence, the most audacious form of Huxley's escapism, an irresponsible book which will only contribute to the stupefaction of the world. Though Mann did reluctantly admit, well encouraged by the persuasive recommendation of the famous author, many Englishmen and especially Americans will try the experiment, for the book sells like hotcakes. A few short years later, in 1960, Huxley was invited to be a visiting professor at MIT. A mile and a half down the Charles River, Huxley's path intersected with another central node of psychedelic history, the psilocybin project at Harvard University, headed by Timothy Leary and Richard Albert. Through the Center of Personality Research, Leary and Albert investigated the psychological effects of psilocybin, the psychoactive element in some mushroom species. Huxley became an advisor on the project, helping Leary and Albert work out a non-clinical, supportive, safe, yet scientifically rigorous framework for psychedelic experimentation. Leary and Albert tested psilocybin and LSD on their colleagues, often conducting experiments in their Newton homes. They had found that the clinical hospital and lab environments were not always conducive to the kinds of sensory and emotional experiences psychedelics entailed. Once these drugs moved out of the clinical space of the hospital and into private homes, their spread into the public sphere grew exponentially. Leary and Albert's research gained national attention in 1963 when Harvard administration fired Leary for shirking his teaching duties and Albert for giving psilocybin to undergrads. This was the first major scandal in psychedelic history, appearing in headlines across the nation. Leary and Albert, who later took the name Ram Dass, became very public advocates for psychedelic use. Along with Ralph Metzer, Madison Presnell, Houston Smith, Gunther Weil, and others, Leary and Albert formed the International Federation for Internal Freedom, an organization to devoting the right to consciousness-expanding practices. As the 60s moved on, Leary took center stage, presenting himself as a psychedelic guru and spiritual leader. Leary's famous slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," became a catchphrase. His public advocacy came with a price: federal suspicion, criminal charges, and imprisonment. Many psychedelic researchers today distance themselves from the Leary legacy, somewhat understandably. Leary's advocacy for psychedelics sometimes reached exaggerated and inaccurate proportions, and may have encouraged people who were not psychologically prepared to take the drug under unadvisable circumstances. Huxley and Leary formed two central nodes of that first phase of psychedelic virality. Americans read The Doors of Perception and news coverage on the Leary research scandal, heard interviews of the two over TV and radio, sparking curiosity and conversation across the nation. Amidst this growing noise, there emerged the work of some of our nearly forgotten figures in psychedelic history, like Adele Davis and Thelma Moss. Under the influence of LSD, lying on therapist's couch with an eye shade over their eyes and music playing in the background, Adele Davis transformed into a glowing silkworm, and Thelma Moss became a clam at the bottom of the sea. They recorded their therapeutic LSD experiences for psychiatric research studies, and later they published their accounts under pseudonym. Adele Davis's Exploring Inner Space by Jane Dunlap was published in 1961, and Thelma Moss's Myself and I by Constant Newland appeared the following year. They were bestsellers of their time, reviewed by major papers and journals, but have curiously dropped out of our historical picture. One reviewer in the New York Times may have warned off readers. The books were, quote, not for the kiddies, especially the sweet girl graduates. The back cover of the 1962 copy of Myself and I prophesizes the viral spread to come. This book is the true story of one woman's experiences with LSD, the new, experimental, and dangerous mind drug that is exploding into use across America. That same year, the philosopher Alan Watts published Joyous Cosmology, a photo essay on his use of psychedelics. Scholarly interest and public awareness of psychedelics grew rapidly in this early part of the 60s. And while Alan Watts, Huxley, and Leary are all well remembered, women like Dunlap and Newland played an instrumental role in the popularization of psychedelic subjects. They presented these experiences in richly effective terms, eliciting the empathy of their readers on an emotional level. Affect, the capacity to feel and to share in another's feeling, are all central to viral phenomena. Emotions compel audiences to pass messages on. Like viral social protest campaigns, the psychedelic aesthetic uses empathy as a rhetorical appeal, much like the consciousness-raising rhetoric of the civil rights, women's, and anti-war movements of that same decade. By the mid-1960s, psychedelic culture began to splinter into two directions, the scientific and the countercultural. These two modes are, however, very difficult to untangle in the case of psychedelic history, as we'll see in the example of Oscar Yangier, the Beverly Hills psychiatrist who gave LSD to actors, writers, and artists to study the effects of creative production. In doing so, he turned on the Hollywood set, reportedly administering the drug to actors Cary Grant, James Colburn, Jack Nicholson, and the novelist Anais Nin. Once LSD became a cause celeb, there was no stopping its spread. Meanwhile, in visual art and cinema, artists like John and James Whitney, Jordan Belson, and Stan Brakhage began building a new library of abstract visual effects that replicated psychedelic experiences. Screened at small theaters and private houses, experimental films from the mid-1950s and early 60s, like Kenneth Anger's The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, Stan Brakhage's Dog Star Man, Ron Rice's Chumlum, had limited distribution, but were praised by critics. Another forgotten figure that I'd hoped to recover is Storm DeHirsch and her avant-garde film Peyote Queen from 1957. The use of day-glow color schemes, otherworldly imagery, abstract expressionist techniques developed alongside new technological advancements in liquid light and sound projectors. Strobe and light projectors were used to disrupt audiences' perceptual sense of space. Music played with their sense of time and duration through mixed overlap tracks and program lags and delays. Light shows became a ubiquitous part of the underground club scenes of San Fran and New York. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters ramped up the psychedelic spread with their travel across the country on a magic-painted school bus named Further. As Tom Wolfe recounts in his classic 1967 New Journalist novel, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, the Merry Pranksters took a road trip across America, turning people on to the psychedelic aesthetic and sometimes even the drug itself. I'll be giving a talk on Ken Kesey at the Spectacular Conference. Just a plug. Based in the San Fran area, the Pranksters helped create the Haight-Ashbury scene. They teamed up with the Grateful Dead and Bill Graham of the Fillmore to stage their famous acid tests. These multimedia concerts, light shows, and performances sometimes included gallons of fruit juice spiked with LSD. Talk about a difficult case to study viral spread. Will we ever really know who drank the Kool-Aid? This LSD was often supplied by underground chemist Augustus Owsley Stanley III, known simply as Owsley. Owsley was connected with many of the major psychedelic figures of the West Coast scene, including Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and the Grateful Dead, as you see here. Word spread of the psychedelic experimentation and radical lifestyles flourishing out west. Many affluent, young, mostly white, adults dissatisfied by the conformity of the suburbs made pilgrimage to the countercultural centers of New York, LA, and San Fran. In a 1967 article entitled The Hippies, Time magazine reported, whatever their meaning and wherever they may be headed, the hippies have emerged on the US scene in about 18 months as a wholly new subculture, a bizarre permutation of the middle-class American ethos from which it evolved. The spread of hippie culture across the American population, of course, involved more than psychedelics. And part of my larger project is actually to put psychedelics back into context with the social justice movements of the decade. So seemingly overnight, LSD became America's phantom problem. LSD and marijuana use made national headlines. Not everyone approved of psychedelics. A great deal of the country remained socially and religiously conservative, viewing hippie counterculture as a dangerous fringe element, contaminating American wholesomeness. Even some liberals fueled psychedelics would compromise the promising reforms of LBJ's Great Society. Acid panic was in the air, the media sensation was overhyped, blowing out minor incidences into fictions of alarming proportion. There were news reports of college students jumping out of windows, of suicides and mental breakdowns. Two stories kept recirculating the national newspapers: a 5-year-old girl who accidentally ate a spiked sugar cube, and a man who murdered his mother-in-law while flying on LSD. The subsequent trial found that the man had long suffered from chronic paranoid schizophrenia. Young women carted off to the mental hospital. That image became a repeated meme in psychedelic virality. Some tabloid photos of LSD headlines. While there is certainly some risk with these drugs, particularly in contaminated substances made by amateur chemists, high dosage, unprepared individuals, unsuitable environments, suicide or violent side effects are extremely rare. Psychedelic use was reportedly sweeping the country, yet there was actual little documented evidence on the scope of use and the long-term effects. This uncertainty was in part due to the silence bred from fear of taboo and later criminal penalty. Only a brave few were going on record. Newspaper stories warned, the nation's colleges and universities are shadowboxing with a phantom of the campus, the potential threat of the hallucination drug LSD. Yet university officials admitted that they really had almost no idea how many students were taking LSD. The only major consensus was that there was more unknown about psychedelics than was known, and that remains the same today. Yet this did not stop the media machine from wild speculation. Some news outlets were more responsible in their coverage. Time and Life magazine publisher Henry Luce and his wife Claire Ruth Luce had taken LSD and helped publish more balanced articles on the subject. The viral media hype about psychedelics eventually had disastrous effects on the legitimate research studies. Amidst this controversy, Sandoz halted production on LSD in 1965 and essentially turned the market over to underground chemists. Responding to public concern, Senator Robert Kennedy led congressional hearings on the FDA regulation of LSD in 1966. Kennedy invited several prominent researchers and government officials to testify on the uses and abuses of LSD. The committee heard repeated expert testimony on LSD's limited physiological and psychological harm, its non-addictive nature, and its therapeutic value. But the drug was still viewed as dangerous. Psychedelic experiences are shown to potentially produce, at times, radical shifts in values and worldviews. As reflected in Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff's fearful remarks, "We aren't dealing with aspirin here, or with a cure for the common cold. We are dealing with compounds which have fantastic social implications that the old medicines do not have." What are these fantastic social implications that Ribicoff mentions? A greater sense of compassion? An impulse towards peaceful coexistence? A rejection of capitalist affairs? A desire for simple lifestyles? These sometimes romantic countercultural values did not exactly fit the mission of post-war global capitalism and the American military industrial complex at the time. In 1966, one government official called LSD, quote, "the greatest threat facing the country today, more dangerous than the Vietnam War." The congressional trials resulted in legislation that banned LSD in California and many other states. Despite Congress's acknowledgement of its therapeutic value, LSD was later classified as a legal Schedule I drug in 1970. According to the Controlled Substances Act, and as enforced by the DEA, Schedule I drugs are those that have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Considered the most dangerous drugs with potentially severe psychological or physical dependence, Schedule I drugs come with the stiffest criminal penalties. So LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, peyote are all currently listed along the very addictive, physiologically harmful, and potentially fatal substances like quaaludes and heroin. The reactionist drug war, like prohibition during the 1920s, has resulted in increased violent crime, new underground economies, mass imprisonment of young Black and Hispanic men, and little impact on the amount of drug use. As we've seen over the last few years in marijuana reform, it may be a big time to reopen the conversation on these substances, about why humans have long sought these altered states, and how we can pursue such use safely and responsibly. After the congressional trials, psychedelic culture spikes tremendously. Media coverage accelerated the speed to distant networks across the country. Hollywood stars like Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson starred in films like Roger Corman's The Trip and Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, and popularized the psychedelic aesthetic for mainstream audiences. The psychedelic aesthetic was eventually taken up by the marketing machine. appearing in advertisements for Campbell's Soup, dry cleaning, Pepsi, and even Best Western hotels. Gradually, the penalties mounted. The aesthetic grew commercially cliched, and the generational mood shifted. By the mid-1970s, music and fashion turned to disco and punk, and the drugs of choice became cocaine, amphetamines, and heroin. So why and how did psychedelic use spread in the 1960s? Answering the how, Terence McKenna makes the provocative connection between LSD's physical materiality, measured in micrograms, and its rapid spread. The surge in media coverage produced acid panic and psychedelic curiosity, perhaps inspiring more people to try the drug than would have otherwise. To answer the why question, it seems that a generation was looking for alternative modes of consciousness and identity that went beyond the constrictive race, gender, and class relations of their time. In the haunting shadow of World War II and the Holocaust, and the still looming Cold War threat of nuclear annihilation, and crippling censorship of the McCarthy era, is it any wonder that people were searching, not only for an escape, but for new ways of relating to one another on a personal and societal basis? Do these same imperatives persist with us today? Initially, government officials dismissed LSD as a short-lived trend. In 1966, National Institute of Mental Health Director Stanley Yoles said LSD was a fad like goldfish swallowing, and another compared it to smoking banana peels. I don't know many goldfish swallowers or banana smokers, but I do see a continued robust interest in psychedelics today. Though we see a viral spike in the 60s, psychedelic culture has remained underground all along. New synthetic compounds are developed by amateur chemists, and psychedelic aesthetic persists in popular culture. The 1990s saw another brief resurgence in such use in the form of MDMA, or E, or ecstasy as it's popularly called. The center of this network was the British acid house and techno scene called the Second Summer of Love. Today, we see another renaissance in psychedelic use, culture, and scientific research. Electronic dance music and festivals are popular among today's youth, and often paired with the use of Molly, another variant of MDMA. We sometimes see headlines that eerily echo the psychedelic panic of the 1960s. But even more importantly, new research on psychedelics is finally being approved, and a wealth of new studies show the beneficial therapeutic use of psychedelics like LSD and MDMA for coping with addiction, PTSD, anxiety, and depression from terminal illness. Much of this research has been supported by the advocacy work of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. There's a really excellent Reddit AMA thread by Rick Doblin from MAPS that I should check out, so search those words. Psychedelics in the arts and sciences are on the rise again. How will we treat their viral spread this time? In closing, I'd like to end on a speculative note, a bit of psychedelic experimentation, if you will. Examining psychedelics through the lens of virality raises some interesting questions about the work we do as theorists, as the observers of patterns, networks, and connection. Could psychedelic ideas in art help scholars imagine the dynamics of viral spread, of our networked life, of our chaotically patterned universe? Several notable innovators in science and technology, including neuroscientist John Lilly, biochemist Carrie Mullis, and physicist Richard Feynman, admit that LSD and other psychedelics played a significant role in their intellectual discoveries. Steve Jobs credits LSD as one of the most important things he's done in his life. Is there a connection, then, between psychedelic insight and the ability to perceive new patterns in connection? Could the cosmic molecular perceptions of psychedelics help us better imagine life on a global scale? As we trace out viral networks, might psychedelics remind us that much still remains outside our perceptual blinders? Are we struck by virality because it offers some psychedelic glimmer of transcendental immanence, a sense of greater global or cosmic force beyond our alienated modern selves? Like these new viral theories and phenomena, the study of psychedelics offers a glimpse of the universe in its infinite complexity, yet makes us ever more aware of what we have not yet to encounter, of what we can only barely see shimmering on the networked horizon.